The sound of military boots slammed against the wooden floor, echoing through Fort Campbell's main training hall like thunder. 200 soldiers stood at perfect attention, their uniforms pressed and their eyes fixed straight ahead. The morning sun streamed through high windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor where General Marcus Patterson commanded absolute authority. "I need a volunteer," Patterson's voice boomed across the space, his 2 stars glinting on his collar. The silence that followed was deafening. Not a single hand moved. Not even a twitch. General Patterson was known throughout the base for his demonstrations. They always followed the same pattern. Pick the smallest, most vulnerable-looking person in the room, then use them as a prop to showcase his superior training and physical dominance. It was cruel theater disguised as education, and everyone knew it. Elena Martinez had been hoping this day would never come. Standing in the furthest corner of the hall, all 5 feet 3 inches of her drowning in an oversized administrative uniform, she tried desperately to become invisible behind the towering soldiers in front of her. Her thick prescription glasses reflected the harsh, fluorescent lights as she held her breath and prayed to remain unnoticed. But Patterson's eyes swept across the ranks like a predator searching for the weakest prey. His lips curled into that familiar predatory smile as his gaze settled on her hiding spot. "You there?" he said, his finger pointing directly at her like a loaded weapon. "Yes, you in the back." Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. Around her, she could feel the sympathetic glances from other soldiers. They'd all witnessed these demonstrations before. They knew what was coming, and they felt powerless to stop it. "Me, sir?" Her voice trembled, barely audible above the hum of the air conditioning system. "Get out here. Now. That's an order." Patterson's grin widened as he glanced at Master Sergeant Rick Thompson standing beside him. Thompson shifted uncomfortably, his weathered face showing the kind of concern that came from years of seeing good soldiers broken by bad leadership. "Today, gentlemen and ladies," Patterson announced to the assembled crowd, "you'll witness the critical importance of hand-to-hand combat techniques when facing a weaker opponent." Elena stepped out from the formation, her trembling hands adjusting her glasses. 200 pairs of eyes followed her movement. Many soldiers shook their heads in silent sympathy. Some quietly pulled out their phones, sensing this would be either educational or entertaining. The young clerk looked like she might faint at any moment, her pale complexion growing even whiter under the harsh lights. What none of them knew was that there are mistakes that can destroy entire careers in seconds. And General Patterson was about to make the biggest one of his life. As Elena walked toward the center of the training mat, her military-issued smartwatch tracked her artificially elevated heart rate. The specialized fitness tracker, standard issue for all personnel, recorded biometric data that would later tell a very different story than what appeared on the surface. But for now, she forced her breathing to remain rapid and shallow, maintaining her facade of panic even as something deeper stirred within her muscle memory. Patterson removed his jacket with theatrical precision, revealing muscles that had been honed through 30 years of military training. His biceps strained against his combat shirt as he rolled up his sleeves, each movement calculated to intimidate the trembling clerk before him. "Rule number 1 in combat," he announced, circling Elena like a shark. "Always assess your opponent. As you can see, she weighs maybe 110 pounds soaking wet. I'm 210 pounds of trained muscle." The crowd murmured their agreement. This wasn't going to be a demonstration. It was going to be a massacre. Thompson had already started preparing medical supplies, whispering to the on-site medic, "Better get the stretcher ready. This won't take long." But something strange happened as Elena took her position. Without seeming to realize it, her stance shifted almost imperceptibly. Her feet spread exactly shoulder-width apart, weight distributed evenly on the balls of her feet. It was such a natural movement that most people missed it entirely. One soldier, a veteran from the 82nd Airborne named Jake Williams, nudged his companion. "You see that? The way she just moved her feet?" "Just what?" his friend asked. "Probably nothing," Williams muttered, but his eyes remained fixed on the small clerk, who suddenly didn't look quite so helpless. Patterson continued his lecture, using Elena as a prop for his ego. "Now, when approaching a smaller opponent, you want to use your size advantage immediately. Watch as I demonstrate a basic collar grab." He reached forward with exaggerated slowness, giving the audience time to appreciate his technique. Elena's eyes tracked his movement with an intensity that seemed oddly out of place on her nervous face. As his hand approached her collar, she shifted her weight almost imperceptibly, creating an angle that made the grab slightly more difficult. "See how she instinctively pulls back," Patterson said, completely misreading her movement. "That's fear, natural reaction from the untrained." He completed the grab, his massive hand easily encircling the collar of her uniform. Now from here, a trained soldier has multiple options. Elena quietly adjusted her watch, its advanced sensors, continuing to monitor her vital signs. She forced herself to maintain the act, even as every instinct screamed to counter the hold immediately. "Sir," she whispered, playing her role perfectly. "You're hurting me." Patterson's grin widened. This was exactly what he wanted. Submission, fear, proof of his superiority. That's the point, clerk. In real combat, the enemy won't care about your comfort level. Around the room, phones came out more openly now. Soldiers sensed they were about to witness something memorable, though none of them suspected just how memorable it would be. The energy in the room shifted as Patterson released Elena's collar and stepped back, addressing the crowd with the confidence of a man who had never been challenged in his own domain. "Now, let's move beyond simple demonstrations," he announced. "I'll show you what happens in a real speed encounter." Elena stood there adjusting her glasses with nervous fingers, but Master Sergeant Thompson noticed something the others missed. During their brief grappling exchange, her sleeve had ridden up slightly, revealing what looked like scarring on her forearm. Not the kind of scars you get from accidents or training mishaps. These were different. Deliberate, professional. Thompson zoomed his phone camera, trying to get a better look, but Elena had already pulled her sleeve down. "Ready position?" Patterson barked, dropping into a combat stance that showcased his impressive physique and years of training. Elena mimicked him. Awkwardly, her arms raised in what looked like a parody of a fighting position. Someone in the crowd actually laughed, and Patterson's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. This was going perfectly according to his script. "Now," Patterson announced, "I'll attack with a simple right hook." In real combat, smaller opponents rarely see it coming due to the speed differential. He chambered his fist, telegraphing the punch for the audience's benefit. 3, 2, 1. The punch came at half speed, still fast enough to look impressive to untrained eyes, but slow enough for everyone to follow the technique. What happened next made the entire room go silent. Elena's response was pure instinct disguised as luck. She slipped left, the punch missing her by mere inches. The movement was so clean, so precise, that for a moment, even the experienced soldiers couldn't process what they'd just seen. Patterson's face flushed red. "Lucky dodge," he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Let's see you avoid this." Without warning, he launched a three-punch combination at full speed. Left jab, right cross, left hook. The strikes cut through the air with professional precision, the kind that had earned him accolades in military combatives competitions. Elena moved like water flowing around stones. She slipped the jab, rolled under the cross, and stepped outside. The hook's arc. Her movements were economical, efficient, almost beautiful in their simplicity. More importantly, her feet never stopped moving, maintaining perfect distance management throughout the sequence. Distance management, she whispered under her breath, the words barely audible. But Thompson heard them. His blood ran cold. Those weren't the words of a frightened clerk. That was fighter terminology, technical language used by people who had studied combat at the highest levels. The crowd's energy had shifted from amusement to confusion. Whispers rippled through the ranks like wildfire. Did you see that? How did she move like that? There's no way that was just luck. Patterson's embarrassment transformed into rage. His carefully orchestrated demonstration was slipping away from him, and he couldn't understand why. The little clerk was supposed to be cowering by now, not dancing around his punches like some kind of professional fighter. But Elena maintained her facade perfectly. She stumbled slightly after avoiding the combination, pushing her glasses up her nose with a shaking hand. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, in that same trembling voice. "I don't know what I'm doing. I just got scared and moved." Several soldiers nodded sympathetically. It made sense. Fear could make people do unpredictable things. Adrenaline could grant temporary abilities that seemed impossible under normal circumstances, but Williams wasn't buying it. He'd seen enough combat to recognize the difference between panic and training. What Elena had just displayed wasn't random movement driven by fear. It was technique, muscle memory, the kind that only came from years of serious training. He started recording more carefully, his phone focused not just on the action, but on Elena's feet, her positioning, the micro adjustments she made between exchanges. If he was right about what he was seeing, this quiet little clerk was about to shock everyone in ways they couldn't imagine. Patterson, still smarting from his missed combination, decided to escalate. "All right, enough playing around. Let's see how you handle real pressure." He moved in closer, using his size advantage to crowd Elena's space. This was basic intimidation, the kind of psychological pressure that had worked on every previous volunteer. Get them feeling trapped and overwhelmed. Then demonstrate a simple takedown that left no doubt who was in control. Elena's breathing quickened, and she took a half step backward. To most observers, it looked like the natural retreat of someone who was scared and outmatched. But Thompson noticed that her backward step had taken her to the exact center of the mat. Not randomly, deliberately, as if she was positioning herself for something. "Please, sir," Elena said, her voice cracking with apparent emotion. "I don't want to get hurt." Patterson's predatory smile returned. "Nobody wants to get hurt, clerk. But sometimes pain is the best teacher." Around the room, several female soldiers exchanged uncomfortable glances. They'd heard rumors about Patterson's training methods, whispered stories about volunteers who'd been injured during his demonstrations. Nothing ever serious enough to warrant official complaint, but enough to make them all hope they'd never be selected. Sergeant Amanda Foster, one of the few women who'd endured Patterson's training before, clenched her fists as she watched. She remembered the humiliation, the sense of helplessness as she'd been used as a demonstration dummy in front of her peers. The way Patterson had seemed to enjoy her discomfort a little too much. "This isn't right," she whispered to the soldier beside her. "Nothing we can do," came the reply. "He's a general." But Thompson was starting to think maybe there was something they could do. His phone was recording everything, and he was beginning to suspect that Elena Martinez wasn't quite the helpless victim she appeared to be. Patterson circled her again, explaining to the crowd about psychological warfare and the importance of projecting dominance in combat situations. But with each passing moment, Thompson became more convinced that the general was walking into a trap he didn't even realize had been set. The question was, who had set it? And why? Patterson's next attack came without warning, a wrestling shot, aimed directly at Elena's legs. 210 pounds of muscle and bone launched forward like a human missile, The kind of takedown that had earned him championships in military combatives competitions across 3 decades. What happened next would be replayed on phones across Fort Campbell for months to come. As Patterson's shoulder dropped for the shot, Elena sprawled backward with textbook precision. Her hips shot back, her chest dropped, and her hands found his shoulders at the perfect moment to stuff the takedown. The movement was so technically perfect that several combat instructors in the crowd unconsciously nodded in approval. But the sprawl revealed something that made Thompson's blood turn to ice water. A small tattoo on Elena's neck, previously hidden by her collar. Foreign text intertwined with what looked like paratrooper wings, but not American wings. These were different, more angular, more aggressive looking. Thompson had seen that symbol before, years ago during a joint training exercise overseas. But it couldn't be. That unit was legendary, their operators ghosts who struck from shadow and vanished without trace. They certainly didn't end up as paperwork clerks in Kentucky. Patterson, frustrated by his failed takedown, transitioned to a clinch. His massive arms wrapped around Elena's body, seeking to use his superior size and strength to control her. It was a technique that had worked against every previous volunteer. It was also a fatal mistake. The moment his arms closed around her, Elena's entire demeanor changed. The trembling stopped. The nervous breathing vanished. Her eyes, previously darting and frightened behind those thick glasses, became cold and focused with laser-like intensity. Thompson's phone shook in his suddenly nerveless fingers as he realized what was about to happen. He'd seen that look before, in the eyes of operators who'd been pushed too far. The kind of calm that came right before violence. Elena executed a perfect arm drag, spinning behind Patterson faster than most people could follow. Her movements were no longer disguised. This was pure muscle memory taking over. Years of the highest level training erupting to the surface like a volcano. She secured a rear waistlock and, with a technique that spoke of thousands of hours of practice, lifted the general clean off his feet. The crowd gasped as 210 pounds of muscle went airborne, controlled by someone who weighed barely half that amount. The physics should have been impossible, but technique and leverage made mockery of size differences. The slam that followed was controlled but decisive. Patterson hit the mat hard, the impact driving the air from his lungs in a whoosh that echoed through the suddenly silent hall. Before he could recover, Elena had transitioned to mount position, her knees pinning his arms with precision that spoke of extensive ground fighting experience. The position was dominant, humiliating, and completely inescapable. "Stop!" Thompson shouted, rushing forward. Everyone stop recording. I know who she is, but his warning came too late. Patterson, his face purple with rage and embarrassment, tried to buck Elena off using pure strength. She responded with a lightning-fast transition to an armbar, her legs swinging over his head as she isolated his right arm with surgical precision. The technique was so smooth, so practiced, that several of the watching soldiers, many of whom had extensive combatives training themselves, simply stood with their mouths hanging open. "Tap out." Thompson yelled at Patterson. "Sir, you need to tap out now." But Patterson's pride wouldn't let him submit to a clerk, especially not in front of 200 of his soldiers. He tried to stack Elena, attempting to use his strength advantage to power out of the submission. She responded by adjusting her angle slightly, applying pressure that sent white-hot pain shooting through his elbow joint like lightning. The general's scream echoed through the training hall, a sound of pure agony that made several soldiers wince in sympathetic pain. "She's Black Widow." Thompson's voice cracked as he shouted the words. "Special Forces, elite level." But even as he said it, Thompson knew he was wrong. Elena's techniques were too refined, too deadly efficient for standard Special Forces training. This was something else entirely. Something that made his combat-hardened nerves jangle with recognition he didn't want to acknowledge. The legendary unit he'd encountered overseas had produced operators who were more myth than human. Women and men who could appear and disappear like smoke, who could neutralize entire terrorist cells single-handedly, who operated in shadows so deep that their very existence was classified above top secret. Elena released the armbar before any permanent damage was done, rolling backward to her feet in one fluid motion. She stood there adjusting her glasses with the same nervous gesture she'd used earlier, but now everyone could see it for what it truly was. Camouflage. A predator hiding. In plain sight. Patterson struggled to his feet, cradling his hyperextended arm against his chest. His face cycled through emotions like a broken slot machine. Pain, rage, humiliation, and finally dawning horror as he began to realize what had just happened. He'd been played. Completely and utterly played. Impossible, he wheezed, still trying to salvage some dignity from the wreckage of his reputation. You're just a clerk. I've seen your file. Elena Martinez, administrative specialist. You've been here 8 months. Elena reached up and pulled off her glasses, revealing eyes that had never needed corrective lenses. When she spoke, her voice had lost every trace of nervousness. Instead, it carried the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove and everything to hide. Actually, General, she said, her words cutting through the silence like a blade. I've been here 10 months. But you've never bothered to look at support staff files, have you? Too busy picking on people you think are weak. Around the hall, phones continued recording. This footage would spread through military social media like wildfire, but Elena seemed completely unbothered by the attention. She rolled up her left sleeve, revealing not just scarring, but a forearm marked with the kind of defensive wounds that spoke of close quarters. Combat where death was measured in milliseconds. One particular scar ran from wrist to elbow, white, against her olive skin. It looked like it had been made by something sharp and wielded by someone who'd known exactly how to use it. The room was dead silent, except for the hum of air, conditioning and Patterson's labored breathing. 200 soldiers stood frozen, witnessing something that would become Fort Campbell legend. But Thompson, still recording with shaking hands, realized they were witnessing something much more significant than a general's humiliation. They were watching the emergence of a ghost. The main doors of the training hall burst open with a bang that made everyone jump. Colonel David Harris strode in, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the scene before him. Patterson on his knees clutching his arm, Elena standing calmly in the center of the mat. 200 soldiers who looked like they'd just witnessed something impossible. Stand at ease, everyone, Harris commanded, though most were too shocked to have been at proper attention anyway. Harris walked directly to Elena, but Thompson noticed he stopped just outside striking distance. That wasn't coincidence. That was the habit of someone who'd worked with elite operators before and understood the importance of maintaining safe space around dangerous people. Miss Martinez, Harris said carefully, or should I say Captain Rachel Miller? Elena's eyes flickered with something that might have been pain. That name belongs to a dead woman, Colonel. I'm just Elena now. The hell you are, Patterson snarled, struggling to his feet. His face was a mask of humiliation and rage. This was a setup. You brought in a ringer to embarrass me in front of my soldiers. Harris turned to Patterson with a look that could have frozen molten steel. General Patterson, you embarrassed yourself. All we did was provide the opportunity. He pulled out a tablet, swiping to a video file that had been recording from a hidden camera mounted in the corner of the hall. 3 months of complaints about your training methods, specifically your habit of selecting the smallest, weakest looking personnel for your demonstrations. Human resources is quite the file on you. The blood drained from Patterson's face as the implications hit him like physical blows. This hadn't been a spontaneous demonstration. This had been a carefully orchestrated trap, and he'd walked into it with all the arrogance that had defined his career. "You see," Harris continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd commanded special operations units in 3 different theaters, "I needed concrete evidence of whether the complaints were valid. Miss Martinez was kind enough to agree to help expose the truth." He glanced at Elena with genuine respect. "Though I must admit, I didn't expect quite such a thorough demonstration." Elena shrugged, the gesture somehow both casual and dangerous. "He asked for a volunteer. I volunteered." A nervous laugh rippled through the crowd, quickly stifled as Patterson's glare swept across them. But the power dynamic had shifted irrevocably. The general who had commanded through fear and intimidation now looked small, diminished by his own hubris. "This is ridiculous," Patterson spat. "So she knows some moves. That doesn't change the fact that she's been lying about who she is. That's fraud, identity theft. I want her arrested." Actually, a new voice spoke from the crowd, and everyone turned to see Master Sergeant Williams stepping forward. "I ran her clearance myself when she was hired. Everything checked out because everything she told us was true." Williams held up a tablet showing Elena's personnel file. Elena Martinez, born in El Paso, Texas. Previous military service with Allied forces through dual citizenship. Honorably discharged. Not her fault you never bothered to read past administrative clerk on her file. More soldiers began stepping forward, particularly the female personnel who had endured Patterson's demonstrations over the years. Sergeant Foster, still bearing faint bruises from the previous week's training, moved to stand beside Elena. "She's been teaching us self-defense after hours," Foster announced. "For free. Real techniques, not just the theatrical stuff we get in official training." "Without authorization," Patterson barked, grasping for any violation he could find. "With my authorization," Harris corrected smoothly. "Did you really think I didn't know about the evening training sessions? I've been monitoring them for months. Miss Martinez has improved our female soldiers' combat readiness more in 10 months than your program has in 3 years." The revelations kept coming like artillery strikes against Patterson's crumbling authority. Elena watched it all with the detached interest of someone who'd seen powerful men fall before. She'd learned long ago that the mightiest fortresses often crumbled from within when their foundations were rotten. Thompson, who had been standing frozen since recognizing her capabilities, finally found his voice. "Begging your pardon, Colonel, but if she really is special operations level, what's she doing here? Personnel like that don't usually end up filing paperwork in Kentucky." Elena's expression darkened, and for a moment the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. "What I'm doing here, Sergeant, is trying to live a quiet life. Sometimes warriors need to rest." She paused, her hand unconsciously moving to her ribs where more scars were hidden beneath her uniform. "And sometimes they need to disappear." "Disappear? From what?" someone called out from the crowd. "From themselves," Elena replied quietly, and something in her tone made it clear that this line of questioning was permanently closed. Harris cleared his throat, bringing focus back to the immediate situation. "General Patterson, you have 2 choices. Accept a lateral transfer to a desk position where you'll have no direct authority over personnel, or face a formal board of inquiry into your conduct. Given what we've just witnessed and recorded, I think you know how that investigation would conclude." Patterson's jaw worked soundlessly, his face cycling through shades of red and purple like a broken traffic light. Finally, through gritted teeth, he managed, "I'll take the transfer." "Wise choice. You're dismissed. Report to my office at 0800 tomorrow for your new assignment details." Harris waited until Patterson had limped from the room, his massive frame somehow seeming smaller than Elena's compact form. Then he turned back to her with an offer that would change everything. "Miss Martinez, I have a proposition for you." Elena was already shaking her head before Harris could finish his thought. "I'm happy where I am, Colonel. I file reports. I organize schedules. I train a few people on the side. It's peaceful. It's a waste," Harris countered firmly. "You could be our head combat instructor. Transform the entire training program. We need someone who understands that fighting isn't about size or strength. It's about technique, intelligence, and adaptation." The offer hung in the air like a challenge that everyone in the room could feel. Every soldier held their breath, waiting to see what the legendary operator would decide. They just witnessed something that would be talked about for decades, and now they were being offered front-row seats to watch her work. Officially, Elena looked around at their faces. Young men and women who would someday face enemies in places where the civilized rules of combat didn't apply. They deserved better training than what Patterson had given them. They deserved to learn from someone who'd actually survived what they might face. But taking the position would mean stepping back into the light. It would mean acknowledging who she really was instead of hiding behind filing cabinets and routine. "Paperwork. 3 conditions," she said finally, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to negotiating with people who held the power of life and death. Harris straightened, recognizing he was about to hear terms from a professional who knew exactly what she was worth. "First, I keep my clerk position officially. I've grown fond of the paperwork, and routine helps me sleep at night." A few soldiers chuckled at that, but Harris nodded seriously. He understood that some people needed normalcy as much as others needed excitement. "Second, we integrate real combat techniques into the curriculum. Not the watered-down versions most places teach, but methods that actually work when your life depends on them." "And third?" Harris prompted. Elena's eyes swept across the assembled soldiers, lingering on the women who'd been used as Patterson's demonstration dummies. "Every soldier trains the same. No separating by gender. No special treatment based on size. In real combat, the enemy doesn't care about your weight class or what's between your legs." Harris extended his hand immediately. "Done." As they shook, Thompson stepped forward with the question that had been burning in his mind since he'd first seen her move. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, I was overseas in 28 in joint training exercise. There were rumors about an operative who took down an entire terrorist cell single-handedly. They called her the Black Widow because her strikes were so precise that targets often didn't realize they'd been hit until they were already incapacitated." He paused, stunning Elena's face for any reaction. "Was that you?" Elena's expression remained carefully neutral. "Rumors tend to grow in the telling, Sergeant. It was 6 men, not a full cell, and they were very much aware they'd been hit." She paused, allowing herself a ghost of a smile. The paralysis was temporary, mostly. The crowd erupted in excited chatter. Soldiers who had filmed Patterson's humiliation were now recording each other's reactions, sharing stories they'd heard about mysterious operators who worked in the shadows between official missions. Several female soldiers surrounded Elena, peppering her with questions about the after-hours training sessions and when the next one would be scheduled. The energy in the room had completely transformed from Patterson's toxic atmosphere of fear and intimidation to something resembling hope and anticipation. But in the midst of the chaos, Elena's phone buzzed against her hip. She glanced at it discreetly, and her expression immediately changed. The number on the screen had no country code, no identification, just 12 digits that made her blood run cold with recognition. She stepped away from the celebrating crowd, moving to a quiet corner of the hall before answering. When she spoke, it was in rapid, fluent Hebrew that none of the surrounding soldiers could understand. "I told you 5 years ago," she said, her voice steady despite the way her free hand trembled slightly. I'm done. Find someone else." The voice on the other end was gravelly, speaking the same language with a Jerusalem accent that carried the weight of old authority. "There is no one else, Scorpion. Viper has resurfaced. The man who gave the order in Damascus. He's active again." The words hit Elena like physical blows. Viper, the code name for the terrorist who had orchestrated the ambush that killed most of her unit 5 years ago. The ghost she'd been running from ever since. The reason she'd buried herself in paperwork and routine halfway across the world. "I can't," she whispered, switching back to Hebrew. "You know what happened last time. What I became when I went after him. I won't go back to that darkness." "You don't have to become anything," the voice said gently. "Just teach. We have a new unit. Young operators who need to learn from the best. 1 month, maybe 2. You train them, share your knowledge, nothing more." Elena was quiet for so long that the caller asked if she was still there. Around her, the celebration continued, but she felt utterly alone with the weight of the past pressing down on her shoulders. Finally, she spoke. "I'll think about it. That's all I can promise. That's all we ask. Peace be with you, Rachel." The line went dead. Elena stood there staring at her phone as if it were a venomous snake, knowing that her carefully constructed new life was about to be tested in ways she'd hoped to never face again. "Everything okay, ma'am?" She turned to find Thompson standing, respectfully distant but clearly concerned. Behind him, the celebration continued as soldiers made plans for the new training regimen, excited by the prospect of learning from a real legend. "Everything's fine, Sergeant," Elena lied smoothly, tucking her phone away and slipping back into the role of helpful instructor. But Thompson had spent enough time around special operators to recognize the signs of someone wrestling with ghosts from their past. The way her eyes kept drifting to the exits. The way her stance had shifted from relaxed to ready without her seeming to realize it. Whatever that phone call had been about, it had shaken her in ways that facing down General Patterson hadn't even touched. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of planning and logistics that Elena navigated on autopilot. She found herself appointed not just as combat instructor, but as a consultant for the entire close-quarters battle program. Female soldiers lined up to thank her, many with tears in their eyes as they expressed gratitude for showing them that size and gender didn't determine capability in combat. But Elena's mind kept drifting to the phone call, to a voice from her past that had shattered the peaceful routine she'd built like armor around her soul. Viper was active again. The terrorist who'd orchestrated the Damascus ambush was planning something new, and her former handlers wanted her expertise to stop. Himdad, as the sun began to set and the crowd finally dispersed, Elena found herself alone in the training hall with Colonel Harris. He was studying her with the keen eye of someone who'd commanded special operators in 3 different theaters of conflict. "The phone call," he said without preamble. It wasn't a question. Elena looked up from the equipment she was pretending to organize. "Personal business, Colonel. Nothing that affects my work here." "I don't believe you, but I respect your privacy," Harris replied. "Just know that if you need to take leave of absence, it can be arranged. No questions asked." Elena nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Colonel. But I made my choice 5 years ago when I walked away from that life. I chose building over destroying. I won't go backward." Harris seemed to accept this, gathering his things to leave. At the door, he paused and turned back. "For what it's worth, Martinez, I think Patterson got off easy. 8 seconds was merciful. Most people who underestimate operators like you don't get the chance to learn from their mistakes." After he left, Elena remained in the empty hall. She walked to the center of the mat where she dismantled Patterson's ego along with his body, remembering the feeling of muscle memory overriding conscious thought. For those brief moments, she hadn't been Elena the clerk. She'd been the Scorpion again, and despite everything, it had felt like coming home to herself. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text message, a single word in Hebrew. Waiting. She stared at it for a long moment, then deliberately deleted it. Whatever ghosts were stirring in Tel Aviv and Damascus, they would have to wait longer. She had a new mission now, one that involved building up young soldiers rather than tearing down enemies. But as she turned off the lights and locked the training hall, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that her past wasn't done with her. Somewhere in the Middle East, Viper was planning something that would require the kind of specialized skills she'd tried so hard to bury. And somewhere in Israel, old comrades were betting that her sense of duty would overcome her desire for peace. The next morning brought a transformed reality to Fort Campbell. Word of Patterson's humiliation and Elena's true identity had spread through military social media like wildfire overnight. Soldiers who had never given the quiet clerk a second glance now watched her with a mixture of awe and curiosity as she went about her normal administrative duties. She handled the attention with the same calm efficiency she brought to everything, filing reports and organizing schedules, as if she hadn't demolished a 2-star general less than 24 hours earlier. But Thompson, who had appointed himself as an unofficial observer, noticed subtle changes in her behavior. The way she checked her phone more frequently, the way her eyes tracked every person who entered the administrative building, the way her hand occasionally drifted to her ribs, touching old wounds that ached with phantom pain. The female soldiers she'd been training after hours noticed the changes too. During their evening session, Foster asked directly, "You're leaving, aren't you?" Elena paused in her demonstration of a knife defense technique. "What makes you say that?" "Because you're teaching us like you're running out of time, cramming in everything you can as fast as possible. Like you're trying to download your entire knowledge base into our heads before something happens." The observation was too accurate to deny or deflect. Elena set down the training blade and looked at her students, young women who had sought her out not for glory or excitement, but for the simple desire to survive whatever the military might ask of them. They deserved honesty. "I don't know yet," she admitted. "There are obligations from my past that may require attention. But I'm not gone yet, and until I am, we train harder. Every technique I teach you might save your life someday, or the life of someone you're responsible for protecting." They accepted this with the stoicism that came with military service, returning to their drills with renewed intensity. Elena watched them practice, seeing echoes of her younger self in their determination. She'd been like them once, before Gaza and Damascus and a dozen other places had carved away pieces of her soul. Her phone rang during the session. This time, she didn't need to check the number to know who it was. She let it ring through to voicemail, focusing on her students, but knowing she was only delaying the inevitable conversation. That night, Elena sat in her small off-base apartment, surrounded by the ordinary trappings of her carefully constructed civilian life. Tax documents for Elena Martinez, a car registered in that name, 10 months of paperwork that created the illusion of normalcy, but could be erased with a single phone call to the right people. She pulled out a lockbox from under her bed, entering a combination she hadn't used in years. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, lay the remnants of Captain Rachel Miller, an Israeli passport, military identification, and a single photograph. 12 women in combat gear, faces painted for night operations, all grinning at the camera with the confidence of the truly elite. She was the only one still alive. The phone rang again. This time, Elena answered. "1 month," she said without preamble, speaking English now. "I train them, nothing more. No operations, no wet work, no resurrections of the past. When it's done, I disappear again. Deeper this time." "Agreed," came the reply. "And I want guarantees that Viper won't know I'm involved. If he discovers I'm back in the game, Innocent people will die just to hurt me. Understood. We'll send transportation tomorrow. No, I'll make my own way. Some habits are worth keeping. She hung up and returned most items to the lockbox, but kept the photograph out. 11 faces stared back at her, frozen in time before. Viper's betrayal had turned their mission into a slaughterhouse. She'd avenged them all eventually, but vengeance hadn't brought them back, and it hadn't filled the hole their loss had carved in her chest. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She tucked the photo away and checked the peephole to find Thompson standing outside, holding 2 cups of coffee and looking uncomfortable. "Figured you might be having a long night," he said when she opened the door. "Thought you could use some company." She accepted the coffee gratefully, and they sat in comfortable silence for several minutes. Finally, Thompson spoke. "You know, nobody would blame you for going back to whatever's calling you. It must be important." "Everything's important, too." "Someone," Elena replied, staring into her coffee. "The question is whether it's important enough to me anymore. And is it?" She thought about Viper, about the new unit waiting for training, about debts owed to the dead. Then she thought about Fort Campbell, about soldiers learning to protect themselves, about a life built on something other than violence and shadows. "Ask me tomorrow," she said quietly. Thompson finished his coffee and stood to leave. At the door, he turned back with the kind of respect reserved for those who'd proven themselves beyond question. "For what it's worth, Martinez, I think you've already done more good here in 10 months than most people do in a lifetime. Whatever you decide, you've earned the right to choose." After he left, Elena returned to the photograph one final time. She traced each face with her finger, remembering their names, their jokes, their dreams for after military service. Then, she placed it back in the lockbox and secured it away. Tomorrow she would make a choice that would define the rest of her life. Tonight she would try to sleep without dreaming of desert sand and blood. But as she lay in bed, her phone buzzed one final time. Not a call or a text, but an encrypted file that bypassed normal security protocols. She opened it against her better judgment and found herself staring at a surveillance photograph. A man's face. Older now, but unmistakably familiar. Viper. And he was smiling that same cold smile she remembered from Damascus. The expression of someone who enjoyed causing pain. The choice, Elena realized, had already been made for her. Some ghosts refused to stay buried. Some debts could only be paid in person. And some warriors, no matter how hard they tried to become civilians, would always answer when innocent lives hung in the balance. She would return to her old life temporarily. She would train the new unit. And maybe, if she was very lucky and very careful, she would find a way to be both the Scorpion and Elena Martinez. Because the truth was, she was tired of running from herself. 3 days later, Elena stood in Colonel Harris's office, officially requesting a month of personal leave. The paperwork was routine, but Harris studied her face with the intensity of someone reading between carefully written lines. "This wouldn't have anything to do with those encrypted calls you've been receiving, would it?" he asked. Elena met his gaze steadily. "I have some unfinished business overseas, Colonel. Personal matters that need to be resolved before I can fully commit to the training program here." Harris leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "You know, I made some calls about you after the Patterson incident. Very interesting conversations with some very quiet people who weren't supposed to exist." Elena's expression didn't change, but her posture shifted almost imperceptibly. Harris noticed. "Relax, Martinez, or Miller, or whoever you need to be. Your secret's safe with me. But I want you to know that you have a home here when you get back. These soldiers need someone like you." "If I get back," Elena corrected quietly. "When?" Harris said firmly. "Because you're not the type to leave a job half-finished and transforming. Our combat training program is far from complete." That evening, Elena held her final unofficial training session with the female soldiers, who'd become something like family over the past months. She pushed them harder than ever before, drilling techniques that might mean the difference between life and death in situations she prayed they'd never face. Remember, she told them as they practiced knife defenses, size and strength matter, less than timing and precision. Your opponent's power can be turned against them if you understand leverage and momentum. Foster executed a perfect disarm, sending the training blade spinning across the mat. Like you did with Patterson? Exactly like that. But Patterson was showing off, telegraphing his moves for the audience. Real enemies won't be so accommodating. After the session, the women gathered around Elena with the kind of reverence usually reserved for living legends, which, she supposed, she had become whether she wanted it or not. "Will you be back?" asked Private Rebecca Johnson, barely 19, and still learning that the military could be both family and nightmare, depending on who held authority over you. "That depends on a lot of factors outside my control," Elena said honestly. "But regardless of what happens to me, you all have each other now. Keep training together. Keep pushing each other. And never let anyone use your size or gender as an excuse to treat you as anything less than the warriors you're becoming." The next morning, Elena caught a military transport to Dover Air Force Base, then a commercial flight to Tel Aviv. She traveled light, carrying only a small duffel bag and the weight of 5 years' worth of carefully suppressed memories. The man who met her at Ben Gurion Airport looked like a university professor. Glasses, cardigan, the soft appearance of someone who spent his days with books rather than weapons. Elena knew better. Colonel Aaron Goldstein had been running shadow operations since before she was born. "You look good, Rachel," he said in Hebrew as they walked through the terminal. "Civilian life agrees with you." "Don't," Elena replied in English. "That name stays buried. I'm here as a favor, nothing more." They drove through Tel Aviv in silence, Elena watching familiar streets that held too many memories. The safe house was in an unremarkable residential neighborhood, the kind of place where neighbors minded their own business and asked no questions about unusual hours or unmarked vehicles stopped inside. Elena met the unit she'd been brought back to train. 12 young operators, 6 men and 6 women, all carrying themselves with the controlled confidence that marked Israel's elite forces. They looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism that she remembered from her own early days. "This is your instructor," Goldstein announced without fanfare. "Call her Sarah. What she teaches you over the next month may keep you alive in situations where standard training fails." One of the younger men, barely past 20 with the kind of arrogance that hadn't been tempered by real combat, spoke up. "With respect, sir, she doesn't look like much." "How do we know she's qualified to train us?" Elena smiled, the expression holding no warmth whatsoever. "What's your name, soldier?" "David." "Cohen, ma'am." "Well, David, why don't you help me demonstrate the first lesson?" Elena stepped onto the training mat in the center of the room. The lesson is about assumptions. What followed was a masterclass in applied violence. Elena moved with the same fluid precision she displayed against Patterson, but now there were no cameras, no audience of impressed soldiers. This was pure education, surgical in its efficiency. Cohen found himself on his back within seconds, Elena's knee pressing against his throat with just enough pressure to make breathing difficult, but not impossible. "Assumption number 1, she said conversationally, not even breathing hard. "Physical appearance means nothing in combat. I've killed men twice your size and half your age." She released him and helped him to his feet with the same casual efficiency. Assumption number 2, your previous training, while excellent, was designed for conventional warfare. What I'm going to teach you works in the shadows, in places where the rules don't apply and mercy is a luxury you can't afford. The room's energy had shifted completely. 12 elite operators now looked at their small, unremarkable instructor with the kind of focused attention reserved for life or death information. Assumption number 3, Elena continued, pacing the mat like a predator in familiar territory, is that this training is optional. It's not. For the next month, I own your lives. You'll learn things that will give you nightmares. You'll discover capabilities you didn't know you possessed. And if you're very lucky, you'll never need to use any of it. She paused, her eyes scanning each face. But if you do need it, you'll survive situations that would kill conventional soldiers. Questions? Silence. Good. We start with hand-to-hand combat, then move to improvised weapons, then to psychological warfare. By the end of this month, you'll understand why they call me the Scorpion. The training that followed was unlike anything the young operators had experienced. Elena pushed them beyond their limits, teaching techniques that existed in the gray areas between military doctrine and assassination. She showed them how to kill silently, how to extract information from unwilling sources, how to disappear into crowds and emerge behind enemy lines. But she also taught them restraint, the crucial difference between necessary force and excessive violence. Anyone can kill, she told them during a particularly intense session on pressure points. Warriors choose when not to kill. As the weeks passed, Elena found herself remembering why she'd loved this life before Damascus had poisoned it for her. The satisfaction of watching young soldiers master techniques that might save their lives. The camaraderie that formed between people who trusted each other with secrets that could never be shared. But she also remembered why she'd left. The nightmares. The way violence became easier each time until it felt more natural than peace. The slow erosion of the person she'd been before the military had shaped her into a weapon. On the final day of training, Goldstein pulled her aside with news that made her blood run cold. "We've located Viper," he said simply. "He's planning something in Syria. Something that involves the chemical weapons cache from Damascus." Elena closed her eyes, feeling the weight of 5 years of carefully maintained peace crumbling around her. "You want me to go after him? I want you to finish what you started. Your team deserves justice, and the world deserves to be safe from what he's planning." Elena looked through the window at her students practicing the technique she'd taught them. Young warriors who reminded her of the woman she'd been before war had carved away pieces of her soul. "One mission," she said finally. "I take him down, and then I disappear forever. No more calls, no more favors, no more resurrections of the past." Agreed. But as Elena began planning for what would be her final operation, she couldn't shake the feeling that some promises were easier to make than to keep, and that some ghosts, once awakened, never truly went back to sleep. 2 weeks later, Elena Martinez walked back through the gates of Fort Campbell carrying the same small duffel bag she'd left with, but something fundamental had changed in her. ICE. The mission in Syria was classified beyond any clearance level that would ever be discussed. But the absence of certain names from international watch lists told its own story. Viper would never orchestrate another ambush, never target innocent civilians to draw out his enemies, never smile that cold smile while good people died for his twisted sense of justice. Elena had kept her promise to her fallen teammates, but the victory felt hollow. It always did. Colonel Harris was waiting for her in the administrative building, along with Master Sergeant Thompson and several of the female soldiers she'd been training. Their faces lit up when they saw her, and Elena felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The warmth of people who were genuinely glad she was alive and safe. "How was your leave?" Harris asked, though his eyes suggested he knew better than to expect a complete answer. "Educational," Elena replied simply. "I remembered some things about myself. Good things and bad things. And what did you decide?" Elena looked around at the faces of soldiers who had become something like family, at the base that had given her the closest thing to peace she'd known in years. Then she pulled a folded document from her pocket and handed it to Harris. "My resignation. From the Israeli Defense Forces," she said. "Official this time. I'm Elena Martinez now, American citizen, combat instructor, and occasional clerk who's very fond of filing reports." The room erupted in smiles and quiet cheers. Foster actually wiped away tears, which she tried to hide behind a cough. "Does this mean you're staying?" Thompson asked. "It means I'm home," Elena replied, and realized as she said it that it was true. "I spent 5 years running from who I used to be, but I've learned something important. You can't escape your past by pretending. It doesn't exist. You can only choose what to do with the experience." Over the following months, Elena transformed Fort Campbell's combat training program into something that other bases began studying and replicating. She integrated techniques from around the world, teaching soldiers that survival often depended more on adaptability than raw strength. She never spoke about her time overseas, but Thompson noticed that she slept better now. The hypervigilance that had marked her early days back on base had faded into simple professional awareness. She'd made peace with her ghosts, somehow, and found a way to be both the warrior she'd been trained to be and the teacher she'd chosen. To become General Patterson, meanwhile, found himself assigned a logistics position in Kansas, where his main responsibility involved managing supply chains for mess hall equipment. His requests for transfer were consistently denied, and his occasional complaints about the setup at Fort Campbell were met with polite suggestions that he focus on his current duties. The story of his 8-second defeat became military legend, shared in training halls and barracks around the world as a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating people based on appearances. But for Elena, the real victory wasn't Patterson's humiliation. It was watching Foster lead a group of new female recruits through advanced combat techniques, or seeing young soldiers walk with the confidence that came from knowing they could protect themselves and others. It was Thompson approaching her one afternoon with a grin and news that recruitment numbers for combat specialties among women had increased by 40% since word of her training program had spread. It was Colonel Harris telling her that she'd been selected for promotion to Chief Warrant Officer, a position that would give her even more authority to shape how soldiers were prepared for the realities of modern warfare. Most of all, it was the quiet satisfaction of knowing that she'd found a way to use skills forged in violence to build something better. The Scorpion would always be part of who she was, but Elena Martinez had learned to be something more. A guardian, a teacher, and living proof that warriors could choose to create rather than destroy. Some evenings, when she was alone in her apartment, Elena would look at the photograph of her fallen teammates one more time before putting it away. She'd made her peace with their memory, and with the woman she'd been in their company. She'd also made her peace with the woman she'd become. And for the first time in years, Elena Martinez slept without nightmares, dreaming instead of young soldiers who would go into harm's way better prepared because of what she'd taught them. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but it was the life she'd chosen, and that, she'd finally learned, made all the difference. The phone on her nightstand stayed silent now, no longer carrying voices from a past she'd finally put to rest. Outside her window, Fort Campbell settled into the quiet rhythms of evening, while inside, a former legend who'd become something better planned lessons that would help keep tomorrow's warriors alive. Elena Martinez was exactly where she belonged, home, at peace, and ready to face whatever challenges the morning might bring. Not as the Scorpion, but as herself a teacher, a guardian, and a woman who'd learned that the greatest victory wasn't defeating your enemies, but choosing who you wanted to be despite what they tried to make you become. The story that had begun with a general's arrogance and a clerk's hidden strength had become something much more important, Proof that redemption was possible, that warriors could learn to build instead of destroy, and that sometimes the most powerful victories were the quiet ones that happened in training halls and classrooms. One student at a time, Elena's journey was complete. But her mission, helping others discover their own strength, was just beginning. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world. Have you ever been underestimated by someone in a position of power? Share your own stories of proving doubters wrong in the comments. Your experiences inspire us and show that strength comes in all forms. Thank you for being part of our community that celebrates the extraordinary moments hidden in ordinary lives.